Hello and welcome, everyone. This is Brad Ward, Director of Community Philanthropy with the Council on Foundations. Thanks for joining us today for the Change from the Bottom Up. This is a conversation with Sam Bressi, the CEO of the Lancaster County Community Foundation, and I'm also joined by his Executive Vice President, Tracy Cutler. We've got a great conversation here lined up for you to dive a bit into what many of you might have seen that came out with the New York Times and Thomas Friedman highlighting at a very effective high level the change that's taking place. But we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about the innovation that's taking place and how this is driving a bit of the strategy. First and foremost, I just wanted to make sure that if you haven't taken a look, right there you can see the web address for the Lancaster County Community Foundation. It's worth taking a look at their website. You might see some of the visuals that are along the lines of what we're talking about today. So just wanted to flag that for you. Once again, there's the fresh pics of the folks that are with me today. I don't want to waste any more time. I want to turn right into the conversation. Tracy and Sam, thank you so much for opening up your schedules to me. I should note that I'm here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on a beautiful, hot summer day, but I'm delighted to be here, right here in the heart of, as the Forbes said, one of the coolest cities to visit, and I definitely would agree with that assessment. But as the article noted, less than 20 years ago, the city seemed to be dying. So that was the sentiment, and frankly, when I spend thousands of miles on the road each year, I hear similar stories and similar challenges across the country that our community foundations are addressing. So I think we should start this off by simply giving folks a quick synopsis of why you do what you do here in Lancaster County.
Well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate you visiting us. It's not only a great place to visit, it's a fantastic place to live. It's one of the most livable cities, healthy cities in the country, and we just love it. So the reason we do the work we do in this community in Lancaster is that we love the community. We see so much upside, a bright future. And although we were thrilled to welcome Tom Friedman, and it was an honor to get to meet him and to have a conversation with him. And we were also really proud of the fact that while he was here, for a day or two, he recognized that something special was happening in Lancaster, and that made everybody proud. But it was a really slim slice view of our community. The Hourglass Foundation, great think tank that exists here and has been here for forever. We're trying to get some of the noise down. Thank you. The Hourglass invited Tom Friedman to Lancaster. The Community Foundation wrapped around that. What the Hourglass does is really create conversations and bring issues to the table. The Community Foundation jumped on, was a partner in bringing Tom Friedman here. He recognized something special. He decided to come back as a reporter, but his view was filtered through basically a small number of mostly 60 plus, Caucasian individuals who had been town leaders and town fathers and mothers over the last 20 years for sure. And I don't want to discredit that was a big deal, and they all played a huge role in where we are. But the Community Foundation's vision is much broader, much deeper. So what we tried to do with that article is invite the remainder of the community, invite a deeper conversation about what's really going on here in Lancaster, and the reality of Lancaster. And just to go a little further, Tom spent his time in downtown. We're booming. The city's booming. There's a housing crisis in Lancaster. You can't find a house to buy or to rent. It is packed. People want to be here, and the downtown is really hopping. The Marriott and Convention Center 10 years ago was a driver of that. We have a number of complex adaptive coalitions that are a part of that. And as we sit here and speak to you today, we're facing north on King Street in Lancaster. And if we take just a little deeper look at our community, and as a community foundation, this is what we have to do. We have 11% poverty in our county of about 525,000 people. You know, that number, although it might, I don't know how it relates to other communities, that's 57,000 people, families who are living in poverty in this community. As we look at the city, we zoom into the city, 29.2% poverty. That's a higher rate than Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. And if sadly we were to turn our view southeast and just focus on the southeast section of Lancaster, the poverty rate is equal to Detroit, Michigan. It's a 40% poverty rate. These are real issues. So as the communities developed and as the downtowns developed, there have definitely been winners and losers. And the Community Foundation is wrapping its head around and its strategy around and developing a process by which we hope to be more inclusive and to bring more folks into the economy.
So I think that's an important segue to think a little bit about some of the initiatives, some of the strategies and tactics you've taken, that you've undertaken to address just that, to look more within the equity, within the more inclusive lens, whereas there were winners, there were losers. So for those who are looking at the screen, you can see some of those projects. They're all over your website, some of the storytelling. Let's talk a little bit about the tactics, the strategies that you are deploying that are a bit innovative and they are a bit different. And it's important to note, we'll get to it more later, they're not driven by asset development. They're driven by a different metric, a different objective. So can we talk about that?
I think we can, and actually, I would argue that asset development is largely driven by the overarching strategy. And when, you know, it's a little, I guess, a little misdirection when you say tactic, because we don't, first of all, we don't come at our work as grant makers. We make grants, and we work with the nonprofit sector, the community benefit sector, to achieve goals, but our work is community building. So our focus out of the gate is on the residents, the people who are building their lives and raising their families and have their careers here in Lancaster. Our focus is there. Their lives have to improve. If their lives aren't improving, we're not successful in what we're trying to do. And you know, our vision, our aspired winning aspiration, as Kedron, who we'll meet later, calls it, is to embolden extraordinary community. And extraordinary community only exists if every single individual in the community has access and feels part of that community. So when you boil down strategies, what we've done about 8 years ago, we embraced a strategy we called the AHA initiative. Creative solutions to real problems. And it was all about innovation. It was all about our organization creating a safe space in the community for nonprofits, for businesses to think in different ways, to try new things, to take risks, to learn from failure and kind of fail fast, iterate, and move on. And so we began working from the perspective of maybe the 60,000-foot perspective, the strategic community culture shaping. Maybe shaping is too much, maybe just nudging. So there was already kind of an innovative culture here. We highlighted it, we elevated it, and we celebrated it. And the idea that we were doing this, really, it brought a lot of people in to try to do new things.
So this idea of community building, almost like creating what I like to say is you're creating a shared sense of ownership, but you all are taking it a step further of ensuring that it truly is inclusive, it truly is equitable. And one of those, Tracy, that Friedman really commented about in the article was the notion that Lancaster County Community Foundation was hosting community champion quiz pop-up booths. Can you talk to me about this idea, how it got started, and how it's informed the work of the Community Foundation?
Sure, yeah. I'll bump off of what Sam described a little bit of our AHA project, which again created this idea of safe space and risk-taking and learning from failure. And a lot of that really drove us to the idea of what are people thinking about? How do we value individuals and individual ideas? And so we've been building on that concept of valuing individuals, not working from the bottom up. That's the title of this, as opposed to only top down. And so we did a few things that came out of that idea of the AHA project. One of the things that we did was challenge ourselves with a giving day. We host the Extraordinary Give. Lots of folks host giving days around the nation. And, you know, our Giving Day was really one of the things we focused on was how do individuals make choices? What do you care about? What are you passionate about? We then looked at Chicago, and we looked at their On the Table initiative, and we hosted something we called At the Table, was kind of our version of that. And out of that, those community conversations, self-hosted conversations in micro communities around Lancaster County, and kitchen tables and in coffee shops and places where people were talking about things they care about. We had some information that told us that 57% of individuals felt like they'd never been asked about their community before. And so that, again, continued to inform and build our strategy around how do we engage individuals, which ultimately has led to this idea of the Community Champion Quiz. We've actually been working with the Knight Foundation in a cohort learning about human-centered design, and this is a project that's evolved from part of that work. And the Community Champion Quiz was really something we wanted to try. We were testing how can we engage individuals through online work, and how can we engage individuals through this idea of pop-up. And we created a Community Champion Quiz, which is really like a personality quiz. You know, we're kind of building a framework and a way to say to people, your voice matters, and we believe that everyone has a positive contribution to make to this community.
It helps that just about every single one of the people that are on your staff are the kind of people that you just want to go have a beer with. You know, they're incredibly personal, you know, you can talk to them and engage with them. And that seems to be permeating a bit of the culture and a bit of the approach that you take. Could you talk a little bit, I mean, you mentioned some really cool initiatives there, Extraordinary Giving, which is a play on Giving Days, At the Table, which is a play on the table grassroots conversation starters, and then the Community Championing Quiz. So there seems to be, and you stated earlier, Sam, that grant making in a different way, you said that it's just an ingredient, it's not the solution. What seems to be really permeating here is the notion that you are deploying all capital. And what I mean by all capital is not just financial. Talk a little bit about what the culture is here, how it permeates in the board too, and how they're part of this conversation.
That's a really interesting question. I've been here 10 years in the role, and when I started, we were a grant maker. We were all in trust for most of our existence, formed a corporation only at around 2000, and so everything we did was, the only value we myopically focused on was the value of our dollars driving projects. And there was a movement afoot, and that's probably why they hired me, to really change that. And we wanted to build out the full breadth of tools that a community foundation has to drive community. When I started, we were getting $7 of application for every dollar we were able to fund. It was a really frustrating experience for me to be saying no 6 times to yes 1 time, and I thought, you know, we have to be more than this. So we really worked on building a strategy that made us more than grant dollars. We built a strategy around community leadership. We made an effort to build a brand and to engage with the community, get to know the community deeply, and we did shift the culture internally. And you mentioned the team that I think everybody would agree. Just about everybody on this team, board and staff, you'd want to have a beer with. But that's scratching the surface. These people who are involved in this community foundation are innovative, they're dynamic, they're passionate, they're engaged. We have a brilliance on, I'm the most lucky community foundation CEO in the country. The team that we've assembled here is really A+ top to bottom. And we have a new Millersville CEO coming into one of our universities here. And the first thing he did after meeting us is say, you know, sign me up. Can I be part of the board? We have 15 board seats, so it's a very narrow. It's not a large board. It's a relatively nimble group. But every one of those individuals are passionate and connected to the community. We talk to them. We call them our nerve endings. So, you know, nerve endings kind of, you know, sense what's happening in the community and bring it back to the central office here to allow us to kind of respond and react. And we do a lot less responding and reacting because we know what the community's thinking. and we're engaged with the individuals who are driving community. Our biggest challenge right now is getting to know the people we don't know, shrinking the community. We have engaged businesses, we have engaged philanthropists, we have engaged organizations and individuals, and then we have individuals that live on the periphery of that engagement. And then we have individuals and businesses that share geography with us but that aren't engaged. So our work moving forward is to find ways, like the Community Champion Quiz, it's really simple, but effective and impactful, ways that we can empower and activate individuals to get more involved in their own community, and then amplify what's already happening good in the private sector and bring the private sector more deeply into community shaping as well.
In the closing, and I want to stop here real quick and just remind the folks that are joining us and listening in, if you have questions for either Tracy or Sam, please don't hesitate to use the question box to submit those. We're going to have time towards the end of this to dive into your specific questions, and so I want to encourage those at any time. I'll be coming back to those. Some of what you were guiding us to reminded me of the closing comments that Thomas Friedman wrote in the article. He notes that this city development was achieved not through improved or new technology, but with new and improved relationships between local sectors. Why was this old school approach successful even in our digital age?
You know, I think that's a really challenging question for me. I think we used technology effectively as a tool that it is, and we continue to look for opportunities to use technology, but technology is a tool. Technology's without the human, interface, without
and I think that's just it. I think it's the human interface, in fact. So it's old school, but it's actually amplifying what individuals are at the table. For many years in many of our communities, a lot of the same people are at the table and kind of involved in conversations. And I think, when Thomas Friedman references these complex adaptive organizations, he's talking about, there's new people in the mix. Maybe there are artists in the mix. Maybe in our case, there are immigrants and refugees who are in the conversations. There are new entrepreneurs. There are different people invited to the conversations, in our organization and organizations across the community that are influencing and kind of interacting and adding new and rich elements to the conversations. I think that's a piece of.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit further, because that's certainly one of the keys that we wanted to draw out of this conversation. And it's the notion that Lancaster has a refugee inflow that is 20 times the national average. Can you talk to me about what the Community Foundation has done to make the city a welcoming place for refugees, the lessons you've learned from those efforts? It's also important to note that as I was walking up the steps, plastered everywhere to your office is the saying,
here there is welcome.
Here there is welcome.
Here there is welcome, and then it's visible Americans.
Invisible Americans. We have an exhibit actually in our community gallery that features and really it doesn't start with the Community Foundation. So it starts with a long history of Lancaster County from its founding as being a welcoming community to immigrants and refugees. We've partnered with our local historical organization to do a study and basically track the history of welcoming in Lancaster County. We work with a group called Church World Services locally. They're a refugee resettlement organization, and they partnered with another artist to do Invisible Americans. Invisible Americans is basically a book documenting images and stories of undocumented dreamers or new Americans, refugees, all across the spectrum. So we put a human face, along with that history, we put a human face on immigration and refugee resettlement in this community. And we're per capita, one of the top 10 cities for refugee resettlement in the nation. And then we worked with the Chamber and some other organizations to bring a group called New American Economy to Lancaster County about 2 years ago to study the economic impact of refugees in Lancaster County. And we've been really pushing on the idea that this is in our self-interest. The idea that this community welcomes immigrants and refugees, it's not a charitable act. It's it's economically vital to the growth of our community. We have 11,000 jobs open in Lancaster County right now. We have immigrants and refugees filling jobs, everything from picking berries on farms to, orthopedic and neurosurgery, the whole spectrum, of the workforce. And so we've been really out front, and we brought our board along. We were doing refugee resettlement work, immigration work, long before it was controversial in the public sector. So, and basically everything we hear politically, the rhetoric around the economics even of immigration and refugee resettlement, and the rhetoric around crime and violent crime and property crime, it's totally inside out and upside down, and we've done studies locally to show that. And we've been kind of on the tip of the spear of this with some really good, solid partners. We feel like it's not a revolutionary idea. It's not a left-wing, it really is a core value of our community and our country, and we feel compelled to be advocates.
So I'm going to remind our folks, if you do have questions for Sam or Tracy, please submit them. It's hard for me. I usually was hearing back from Sam somewhere between 6 a.m. or perhaps after 11 p.m. because that's how busy this guy is. So you've got him for an hour, and I'm shocked that we did, and then to get Tracy on top of it. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. I want to, again, welcome your questions. We'll be coming up to those. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the culture and the strategies that are driving some of this. And this is coming from the council's perspective, the viewpoint that we have of working at the national level with community foundations at all different stages of this game. So what I've got for folks here is just some things to be thinking about as you are trying to process what Tracy and Sam are talking about, because it's a lot of powerful theoretical change. It's a lot of, even just mindset sharing, but then there's always the conversation of then what does it look like to implement on our business model. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is thinking about the strategy, thinking about the strategy statements that will make you successful over time. And I believe the 6 that you see up here, they represent the true components of strategy that must be embraced when thinking critically about the work of community foundations. And I'm going to dive in a little bit and say that when I think of strategy statements, I think about it's the we will do this, we will something. And once you've been able to clearly identify what we will do, then the creativity and the innovation really starts kicking out, because you start to think about how it gets done and how we accomplish it, how we measure it. And so I think that what we have to ensure that our model is embodied in is the notion of we are introducing, teaching, and engaging community stakeholders on best practices of philanthropy. We are establishing a consistent public presence, and that is something that you're hearing from this team. When it comes to donor development, I don't want to understate, and we'll try to talk about this at the end, I don't want to understate the role of endowments. You all have a healthy endowment that is behind you that gives you the latitude to take some of these risks. It allows you to be able to think far more long term. And so we have to be thinking consistently about what actively we're doing to deepen and sustain the relationships with these donors, and how we promote endowments beyond just endowed or annual giving and planned gifts, but what role do endowments play in supporting our community? Thinking further, obviously with the grant making, Sam talked about how it's far more than just it's an ingredient, it's not a solution. But even to start there, if you do have grant making that's part of the process, you have to be operating and owning a very disciplined and effective process that ensures accountability, it ensures support and access. And something here that I think is most critical is you seek ways to be flexible, innovative, and create new ways to support grantees and community partners, but you do it by seeking their input and their feedback. And that's certainly what we're hearing here at Lancaster being supported. From a community engagement perspective, this is a statement, a key strategy statement that is built on the smaller community foundations, the mid-sized foundations, or struggling economies, which is the forefront of what we're talking about here today. And it says we'll actively initiate, promote, and support regional public and private collaborations that achieve local redevelopment for population growth, diversified talent pools, and nonprofit sector professional development. Now, you could identify 3 very different key attributes of your community engagement strategy. And you heard a little bit of that coming out of Sam and Tracy when you heard them talking about ensuring that all voices are at the table. And as Tracy eloquently said, how do we value the individuals and their perspectives in the process? So far we've now hit 4 different strategies. The last 2 key strategy statements are all about the fundamentals, the bedrock of whether or not your foundation is successful, because if you don't have operational excellence, you can't do the other things that we're talking about doing, because they build the trust, they build the reliability of the community foundation. And I'm not going to read what's on the screen, but you can get a sense that it's focusing on the operational standpoint. And the last one is the people. It's the people and the tools that you deploy. This strategy statement is really talking about the environment in which employees operate and what type of capacity do they have to think outside the box. And as Sam identified, the core competencies of thinking with solution making and driving solutions, collaboration, connectivity, and ensuring that everyone's voice is heard, that's a unique skill set. And it's critical to the peoples and systems if you want to be able to deploy some of this community leadership work we're talking about. So that was on the strategy side. I just wanted to quickly comment on the culture. You heard a lot about the behaviors and the decision making that goes into Lancaster's approach. And I think that what culture really defines is how are you going to act in the marketplace. And when I think of the marketplace, I think for community foundations, it is wholeheartedly their community. Within that are different subsets of characters and actors that make up the community. It certainly is donors, it's nonprofits, it's public and private partners, and the list goes on. But what's key there is that you are not just focused on one particular subset of the market, but you're thinking about it holistically. All of this culture is driven by some guiding principles, and those guiding principles help you, improve sort of what I like to say is the culture and attitude that you project is how you will approach the work, and culture is rooted in these guiding principles. And for community foundations, what we're seeing bubbling up as sort of the core competencies and the guiding principles in terms of those that are really active in the type of work that Sam and Tracy are describing is, number one, their vision is broad, but their focus is long-term. And what that really means from a behavioral standpoint is you are advising the process. You are advising in a way that allows people to be heard, and you're feeding back what they're saying. And so you're a feedback loop system to be thinking about what is the vision for our community in all the different formats that it comes, and how do you focus long-term. Nonprofits and donors come to us with great ideas. That means you're an inviting place, and you are constantly setting the example that you want innovative approaches, you want creativity. Moving forward and thinking about the highest standards for local giving, this just simply means you're helpful and you're the place where people can trust and ensure that their dollars are going to be put to good use. The next one is certainly what we're hearing a whole lot about with this team, is that the resources are far more than the money. So this is about how you deploy all your capital, your social, your reputational, and your human. And it means that you are looking for connections and you're connecting people, and you're seeking innovative opportunities for a better place. That's plain and simple. And so you're leveraging those ideas, you're leveraging those inputs. All of this leads to the fact that conversation seems to be key. Conversation matters, and you need to be brave enough to start the conversation that matters. And as Sam identified, we could sit here and tout the great things that were featured in the New York Times article, but there's a real challenge that remains, and you seem to be focused on ensuring that raises. And this slide is really diving into how do you as a community foundation have this conversation at the board level? What are the questions that you need to be raising? And some of this is going to come down to how are your boards evaluating the success of the community foundation. If they're evaluating it purely on assets and size, it leads you to a whole different set of metrics. So the conversation needs to be at the board level about the funding that is going to be needed to do different work and to seek different outcomes. What is the staff alignment? What is the staff required to actively participate in this community work? All these important initiatives means that the majority of Sam's team is not sitting back doing transactional work. You're actually doing transformative work, and the board has to talk about that. And if you have a board that's dedicated to community leadership, then there's going to be a question about how anxious do they get of what dollars are coming in the door. And you have to ask yourself, if you're doing all this work, has the board ever discussed the possibility that assets may stagnate, they may decline because of market conditions and the deployment of capital? And what is that, what concern do they have about that from a community perspective? The last question that goes along with that is, has the board ever asked the question of whether they should be investing their assets beyond Wall Street and grant making? How do you do local loans and local RFI programs that are all about the ROI on Main Street? And how do you make direct investments, which are driven with this idea of engagement and perhaps even ownership of community processes? I said it, it's not on here, but it also includes how are you deploying all of your capital. Moving forward on the questions for your board, as you dive into this, you're going to inevitably be faced with the question about being an unbiased community organization. How unbiased can you be when you have to start taking positions? So there are implications of this just by the funding that you do. So even if you are not taking a position, you're not taking a stance, purely by the grant making you do, where you deploy those dollars, says a little bit about what you prioritize. And if you can think about that, you already are making choices and biased choices. And you have to talk about the role of the community foundation that goes beyond the funder. What does resident engagement look like? So Sam and Tracy talked about some pretty cool ways that they're doing resident engagement, but you have to talk about when does it go wrong. And all we have to do is look to places like Charlottesville, Virginia, or even up in Duluth, Minnesota, which I'll be featuring in my newsletter this Friday, where civility has gone wrong in all places, Duluth, Minnesota, where I'm pretty sure we think everyone in Minnesota is really nice. So this does go wrong, and you have to talk about what it looks like when it's successful and when it isn't. The last thing I want to bring up for the board is the notion you're a forever institution. How much changing of course for the community should you be facilitating? If you keep the status quo, where's that going to leave you? And if you can't partner with everyone, how do you pick the one or two charities or the right public institutions or partners in big ways? Sam's got a pretty robust team here. Not all of us are blessed with lots of bodies that can do different work. So sometimes you do have to pick places, and the hope is you're picking winners and not losers. Questions for your staff. What are the divisions within your foundation regarding community leadership? Who does what? And this is a pretty common question of who's on first and who's on second, and what role does finance play in all of this, and just is it just the programmatic people, or is it just the CEO? There's a real conversation if you're going to be looking differently at your role and you're thinking about the change from the bottom up. It's going to require everyone at the table, and you're going to have to discuss how financing approaches it and how the programming focuses it. Last, you got to make sure that the CEO understands what it takes to do community leadership. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of talent, and it takes a tremendous amount of resources, and you got to decide who does what and who does it when. And frankly, you got to be able to know when you can tell Sam to say, you know what, we're not ready to go there yet. So I imagine that this place has fostered good conversations to think critically about their role. Last one on this page is, does your communications team tell the story of your community leadership? Who decides how and what gets attention? If again, I pointed to you to the Lancaster County Community Foundation website for a reason, because of the story that they were telling. The role of your strategic plan, all I want to say about this is that you've got to determine the role your foundation wants to play in the community. If you decide what the community needs you to be, this is a whole lot easier. to point yourself in the right direction. And you have to envision what might be the variables that you wish to see 3 to 5 years out. If you can think broader and longer term, this makes a whole lot more sense for this to be integrated into your strategy. Just a few more things on the role of the strategic plan. You have to look at where leadership is prioritized, how much of your time is spent on grant making compared to convening, and so forth. You have to look at where you are spending your time. And then all of this will eventually impact your processes, your grant applications. What information do you really need? What are you asking for? How much time are you spending on grant request forms and RFIs? And is there other ways to be engaging? Can you look for new ways to get requests for proposals? Is there a way to do a different form of outreach? And lastly, what are these site visits telling you? What insights do they give you as a community foundation for your board and your donors? So all of this plays into just thinking a little bit differently about your work. And so with that, I'd like to turn this back over to the main event, which is Sam and Tracy. First, any thoughts or feedback as you were listening to some of that, where it's disconnected, where it's right, any thoughts?
Well, I think you mentioned earlier a robust team. I just wanted to point out our robust team is a team of 11, so it's not like 111. It's a small team, but we do deliver operational excellence, top to bottom, and I think if you want the right people, which when you have a team of 11, you have to have the right people at the table. People want to be part of big things. People want to be engaged in things that are transformational. So the idea of hiring a program officer to deliver 3 cycles of grant making and doing report check-ins on progress of individual grantees. If I tried to hire that, I would not be able to get the talent that we're able to get. We still do those functions, but our team, including all of our program officers, including our communications folks, including our finance team, including our Forever Lancaster individual, they're all engaged in something that they know is bigger than themselves. And they all feel part of transforming our community in unique ways. So I really think that's been part of the messaging to the community. Culture is what individuals feel when they engage with you. It's how they feel. And we've actually spent a lot of time over the last year or two, even with our events that we do in the community to engage folks, rather than, we've made really a shift in the last 2 years. A shift of trying to boil down informational nuggets that we want it to leave people with, that people basically walk away and it's just really hard to in a gathering of 500 or 50 or 10 to kind of transfer a lot of information. But people remember how they feel and how they felt at an event. And so we've been doing a lot of work around making sure people feel the culture, making sure people feel welcome, making sure people know that we're available to them and we're accessible, and we are actively seeking their input and their engagement. And it's really, I think, it's been one of those times when we've actually been able to make a shift that's palpable.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about, the role of endowments and this long-term opportunity, we've been able to kind of take that and think about our resources as an opportunity to engage people and help people draw them into this culture. And when we think about the idea of strategically, instead of focusing on each individual grant is exactly what we're doing, but kind of lift our heads up a little bit and think about how can we create a culture not only that we as the team want to be part of, but that the community wants to engage with. And that means donors, and that means, community benefit organizations, nonprofits, and that means our public sector and our private sector who are interested in what's the community foundation doing, and wow, what is this that you're talking about? What is this idea of innovation? What is this idea of inclusion? We want to be part of that.
And the answers are sometimes really complex. So they're not one-liners. And I think we've wrestled at the board level and internally with what's the place of the community foundation? And bear with me on this, but measurable and accountable, and it's like responsible and things. If we're about doing grants to proven approaches that make incremental change, that's literally diminishes our value as I see it. The idea that the Community Foundation is approaching the community with is, look, our work is less measurable in any instance. So when we dove into innovation and we dove into driving creative solutions, that was a big idea that we held out there. We put money into that, into creating safe space. And what happened, because we were at that strategic level, is the community responded with ideas and in ways that we could have never predicted. So if we would have been required by our board to say, okay, where are we going to be in 5 years? We would have been able to put words around maybe this, maybe that. But what happened from that is we had a local Community First Fund, a lender that approached and learned and developed the capacity to bring new market tax credits to Lancaster and to the region, actually. We were the first dollars in. There was no guarantee, and we put over a 3-year, 4-year period, we put about $400,000 into their capacity building effort around this. There was no guarantee on the front end that they were going to be successful in securing new market tax credits. But in the second year, they were successful, and they brought something like $7 million or $8 million of new market tax credits. Since then, it's been $55 million of new market tax credits that have come regionally, but we were the very first dollar in to do that. We invested in a housing partnership locally. They had never owned property. They had never bought, they had never tried to secure a neighborhood, transform a neighborhood through ownership. Because we were pushing innovation, they kind of came in behind that, with that as cover, call it the safe space. And they started to work in the southwest corner of Lancaster. And so we've been out of that. We put a couple $100,000 in over a multi-year period. We've been out of that for several years. Wells Fargo's come in behind, put almost $1.3 million into the SOWE project, Southwest Neighborhood Project. None of that would have happened without our catalyzing dollars on the front end. But if my board would have said, well, what's going to happen from a housing perspective, in 5 years, I would not have been able to tell them. So we've been able to, and with the cover of our board and the long-term nature of our assets, we've been able to get out ahead in a strategic way and do grant making that's a little ambiguous, that's a little more strategic and less tactical, and that by nature makes it a little
kinds of innovations and that you've done the work. So very interesting. Tracy, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, so we talked a little bit about endowment building. How has this helped you? We talked about extraordinary giving, which is the Giving Days model, where so lots of money is flowing for immediate needs and helping facilitate opportunity. And that creates a funnel, so I'm not denying that one bit. But I am curious about all this work that you're doing. How has it helped you build traditional funds like designated or unrestricted or field of interest funds, and particularly, is it helping build endowment funds?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a question, that, a lot of folks are thinking about. And as Sam mentioned earlier, this community foundation has grown up, basically on the backs of many, many individuals over time who've given. We did not have a robust development strategy for many years. And we actually, when Sam entered the picture, I think there was a shift in what we learned was that we really needed to build and cultivate trust in our community. And so we spent a lot of time building that trust and building that credibility. And the Extraordinary Give was one way that we did that. In fact, we are very specific about when we launched our Giving Day, we said, here's why we're doing it. We want to reintroduce ourselves to this community and say, we care about what you care about. We are here for you. We built the biggest tent possible to bring in as many organizations as we could and invited as many individuals as we could to participate in giving to causes that they care about. And so as a result, you know, those pieces have started to build out. And as we have introduced what we call Forever Lancaster, which is really a development strategy just in the last year or so, you know, we've gone at that with this idea of how do we keep bringing more people in? So funds are in fact coming in. But again, I think this goes to the bigger idea of the larger strategy. The larger strategy is about how we're emboldening the community. And so by bringing people to events and engaging them in giving days, they are getting caught into the energy cycle that's happening with the Community Foundation. And so really the development is wrapping into that. So it's actually less about just come open a designated fund or include this in your will, and more about why do you care about this community? And here's what we can do together. And here's one way you can do it. Grant making is one tool, opening a fund is another tool, and our community's endowment is a way that we can together move things forward.
And our board hasn't put a huge amount of pressure on us to grow the assets and go down in the minutiae of the metrics. But last year, when you couple investment performance with extraordinary give with new assets in the door, it was a $28 million year. So what we're doing is working. The energy that's been created, people want to be associated with the Community Foundation, not because it's the Community Foundation, but because our brand is coupled with innovation, big ideas, big swings, risk-taking, and taking a stand where, we talked a little bit about refugees, immigrants. This is definitely a politically polarizing issue. You could take the approach that, boy, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Half the people, you're going to lose half the people. The fact is that it's a draw. People respect, even people who disagree, respect the fact that we're taking a stand, that we're backing it up with data, and that we're driving for positive change.
And so one of our attendees asked a pretty critical question about this, and so Tracy just took a look at it, that drives deeper into this question of the polarizing nature of refugees, the poverty that comes along with it. I mean, we have to remember they're first-generation immigrants. They're starting from the bottom up, and so perhaps we could dig a little bit deeper. So this member who's joining us is talking about how impressed they are about you talking about the welcoming community, the importance of your openness, of accepting refugees and immigrants, how they're making a positive impact on the economy, which seems to be a little bit disconnected from the poverty rate. So if we could talk a little bit about that, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and there are elements that do couple that relate. But in the study that we did, which is available on our website, the actual impact on our economy is about $1.3 billion of GDP annually from immigrants and refugees. So we've been able to isolate that through the help of New American Economy. The refugee population actually has a higher level of education than our native-born Lancastrians, which is kind of shocking. And they're actually more likely to start their own businesses. With respect to poverty, we have generational poverty on the southeast side of the city. I mean, this has been an entrenched issue for a long time. What's happened, and I'm going to be talking with our legislative delegation about this on Friday, so this gives me a good maybe a practice run. But what's happened is we've seen the downtown develop in a way that's pretty extraordinary, and several neighborhoods in Lancaster have really benefited, but it's put upward pressure on rents and on housing costs. I mean, it's less affordable to live in Lancaster City now than it's ever been. And what that does, if a family had a blue collar job, was working at the very margin, that upward pressure on their rent can be devastating. And so that's been a big part of this. Our success as a community in certain areas has actually exacerbated on the bottom end economically, has exacerbated their challenges. what we're trying to do, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about how we pull the private sector in. This is not a social issue. It is a social issue, but it's not exclusively a social issue. It's an economic development issue. The idea that we have human capital within a block of this office, that if we can figure out some of the social challenges, if we can get them plugged into training, they're a resource that can drive growth of our economy. 11,000 unfilled jobs and companies that are dying for skilled manufacturing workforce, skilled service workforce. So we're trying through a lot of different means, technical training, and you know, a group called the Commission to Combat Poverty, which we funded out of the gate, the Mayor's Commission, to really deal with this head on.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, to the point of this question, it's a lot of what Sam is saying, and it's this idea of how do you help your community find the facts that are real in your community. You know, we've had the ability to do that by partnering with this new American economy. What are the facts that are real about immigrants and refugees? And then what's the history of your community? What does that look like, and how does that translate into today? And then this idea of data, and how do you integrate these complex coalitions? Like Sam mentioned, you know, we're working with our business community on this topic. We're going to be working with our legislators and government, and so building those coalitions, you know, rooted in history and rooted in facts and data. You know, those are things. And then lastly, putting a humanizing face on it. I mean, that's certainly something that's been really successful for us, is humanizing individuals who are new to your community, individuals who are experiencing poverty, and being able to kind of link things in those ways. So the data, the history, the human elements, I think, have been really successful.
So Franklin and Marshall College did a deep dive into basically census data. It was data that existed on poverty in our community. And what they did is they drilled down into basically zip codes that got to neighborhood poverty. And that was what gave us this first look at, wait a minute, it's not 11%, it's 29.2, wait a minute, it's not 29.2%, it's 40% in the Southeast. So it was like ripping kind of opening our eyes, and it was painful to see. And there was a lot of teeth gnashing and hand wringing when that data came out. And I sat with the mayor, I actually walked with the mayor home after a meeting, and this is our former mayor, and he said, you know, this is a hard problem. You know, we have so much good going on. This might be impossible to fix. And if we let it go for a week or two, it'll be out of the news cycle. You know, and we left, and I didn't really know, I kind of knew Rick wasn't the kind to let it go. And literally the next day I had a phone call. We can't let this go. We've got to deal with this head on. What can we do? So we immediately committed to funding the Mayor's Commission to Combat Poverty. Again, that's why we know this. We could have easily just focused on the Thomas Friedman downtown Lancaster. There's a lot of good things that are happening here, and they're fun and engaging. But really, we believe there's an opportunity with everyone, refugees, immigrants included, but they're not, you know, the poverty is much deeper, runs much deeper and broader than just refugees and immigrants. So we believe that really building those bridges to the private sector, it's an important part of our work.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think you've addressed the question here, and the data has helped drive a lot of the reality that really is just untrue about the story being told of immigration, in the sense that it puts an extra burden on our nonprofit services, that it's driving down wages. It has the capacity to do quite the opposite if we look at it with the right lens.
If you think about a refugee, what a refugee has to go through, and I won't go into it, but to be able to get to somewhere, to be able to have the wherewithal to be a refugee. We do something every year in partnership with Assets Lancaster called the Great Social Enterprise Pitch. It's basically a social enterprise Shark Tank, but it's a really friendly business development around business for good. And last year, the winner of that grand prize was Mustafa Noor, a Somali refugee who's been here for about 4 years. Mm-hmm. Spent 9 years in a refugee camp, young guy, the most energetic guy. When you meet him, when you get to know him, He's just a phenomenal individual. To have him in Lancaster, I wouldn't trade him for anybody. He is going to, his company's called Bridge, and I think you can go on to experiencebridge.com. Is that right? Close. Google it. Basically, he says, I am not trying to teach them to fish. I'm just reminding them that they know how to fish. His whole business model is having refugee families share their culture with Americans, with individuals. And it's just an incredible project that he's working on, and he's an incredible individual. And we have hundreds of stories like that in Lancaster.
So this is a really good question, and we're almost out of time, so I want to make sure that we address this. So we talked a lot about the power of the endowment behind you to give you this credibility. So what about the community foundations that are interested in taking risks? And if you were talking directly to them, which you are right now, what are some of the strategies for them who do not have large amounts of unrestricted money available to them?
Well, yeah, Tracy's pointing to a word that we've kind of ingrained into our strategy along with our board, and it's fearlessness. So but you can't lead with fearlessness, exactly. And we talked about this. Fearlessness is great, except it's really close to reckless. It's, it can be careless. So if you're going to take risks, I would, and this I learned at a council event. The more risk, the more volatility, the more controversy that you are delving into, the closer you need your board leadership. You need to have buy-in from the people who are employing you. And it can be done. It might take longer than you think. You might get out in front every now and then, as I have, and get slapped back. And it's not comfortable and it's not fun. But the idea of having a conversation and having a board and a team that's ready to take a risk, ready to kind of delve into an issue that's really important to the core value of your organization. If it's like, for instance, refugee and immigrants in Lancaster, I was able to converse with my board around the idea of, we've been doing grant making. I could bring out the grants. We had thousands of dollars in a refugee community school, one of the first in the nation that we had invested in. It was a $150,000 grant. We had grants that went back to Church World Services, different things that we were doing. And we were then able to say, look, we're not doing anything new, but we need to take a leadership role. We need to be in the newspaper. We need to be in front of people. We need, as an organization, to get the facts to the community so that we can value this issue and make decisions on this issue from the standpoint of what's truly happening and its true impact on our community. And again, I go back to the idea of, our welcoming of immigrants and refugees is not a charitable act. They're not a drain on our system. We proved it with economic data. It is literally an important strategic economic driver for Lancaster County. So, taking risks, you need to have people alongside of you. You don't want to crawl out on your own on the limb, unless you're a sole proprietor or unless you're a private foundation that it's your money. I want my board and my team side by side with me or just behind me.
Which really means that you have to have a lot of conversation to ensure that we're on the same page, and ultimately it's being a follower, not necessarily a leader. Sometimes you're following the right good ideas, the things that are taking shape and taking form, and you push your credibility, you push your might toward them. It's a great question, and I want to be sensitive to time. And Tracy, I just want to ask two questions. The first one's a simple one. Are the questions and the processes that you used for the community championing quizzes, are they available? Could people take a look at what questions you were asking and how is that available?
It is. I mean, people can go and take the quiz, which is at lankfoundchampion.com. And so people can take the quiz, and I will give all the credit to our brilliant communications manager, Aaron Spengler, who really was the driver on this. He was the impetus behind it, and he really helped to develop the questions to the quiz with some specific individuals in mind.
Very good, very good. Because I know that folks are going to want to see what they can copy and steal and what they can learn from that process. The last thing, Tracy, I want to ask you, and then Sam, I'll give you the final comment of the day. Any final thoughts of why this approach is critical to community foundations?
I think community foundations have a unique role in their communities. By and large, community foundations aren't partisan, they're not membership organizations. We have in these spaces a chance to look out across the landscape. We see the work that the nonprofit sector is doing. We're tuned into what the private sector is doing, the education sector, and we have a unique opportunity to connect the dots and to really help our community see things that people who have to be micro-focused on specific issues don't have the time to look at. So as community foundations, we're in a unique space, and I think that's awesome.
30 seconds, Sam, same question.
Well, I just think we have to keep the focus on the positive. Every challenge, every entrenched challenge in a community can be flipped into something that's a real opportunity for community development. I do think we have to, as leaders of community foundations, we have to be willing to risk. We have to be willing to live our values. We have to be able to pursue higher level strategies and big ideas with fervor and fearlessness. And I also just will tell you that I hope while you were listening, you could eat your lunch and that this wasn't a waste of your time. And if there was anything that we said that resonated or that you're curious about, that you'd like to dive deeper into, I am so blessed to have been able to steal, beg, borrow, copy from so many community foundations, including Pittsburgh, Chicago, and many others, that I am always, we are as a team, always available to other community foundations if we can ever be a help or a support in the work you're doing in your hometowns.
And I can attest firsthand, looking out on, I believe, King Street. Am I looking at King Street here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania? It's a great place to go grab a beer. There are plenty of places to do so. We've got great company here with Sam and Tracy. I want to thank both of you for your time, opening up your foundation to us and exposing a bit of what's going on underneath, both the challenges as well as the great opportunities that you are presenting. To all of you who joined us, thank you. This webinar has been recorded. It'll be available after the fact. I hope you will join us. We have more great webinars and learning opportunities here this month, including August 22nd. I believe I'll be joined with Brian Del Rosario. He's our legal counsel. He's a fabulous colleague to work with on agency endowments. So we'll be talking all about agency funds and the joys that they bring us in our community foundation world. So with that, I'm signing off. Thanks again for joining us. This is the Council on Foundations.